Then my mind kind of shifted from I'm here to run 100 miles or 12 hours today, which is, a pretty big thing to wrap your mind around, to I just got one more long run to do, which I've done a lot of, and I can do that.
Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the One Life Podcast. I'm your host, Devin Rodriguez, and our goal with this show is to enable and empower you to discover who you are so that you can take full advantage of the one life you have to live. On this episode, we have an in-depth discussion with one of the greatest ultra-endurance athletes of all time, Zach Bitter. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and enjoy the show. Today's guest is Zach Bitter. And as I was telling Zach, and as you guys know, I usually do pretty in-depth introduction, but I just want to read off a couple of things to you about Zach and what he's accomplished. To start off, Zach ran 100 miles in 11 hours and 19 seconds, which comes out to a pace, Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, of 6:48.
Yeah.
6:48. He has the world record for 12-hour run, in which he ran 104.8 miles, which is approximately half the time it took me to run my 104.8 miler, which blows my mind. And just last week or the week before, Zach, you just set the treadmill 100-mile world record at approximately 12 hours and 9 minutes, which is a 7:18 pace, which is sickening to me on a treadmill. And I think you might have took one break, I think I read. But without further ado, Zach, thank you so much for being here and joining us. And I really want to dive into, not only the world records, but you as a human being. So thanks a lot for being here with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Devin.
So Zach, I just want to start off. So obviously you are one of the top ultra endurance athletes, not only of today, but of all time. But I always like to start with getting a little perspective as to who you were growing up. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your story and who Zach was as a kid and then growing up to where you ultimately are now.
Yeah, I think growing up, one of the things that kind of like sticks out in my mind that would maybe be applicable to what I'm doing today is just like I had a lot of opportunities to participate in sports and just be active. My parents were really good about not necessarily telling me I had to do any one sport or that I had to be doing this, that, and the other thing, but just saying like you should be doing something, but it's kind of up to you to pick what it is. So find what you're interested in and play around with it. If you don't like it after a season or a year, then you can always kind of try something else out. So with that experience, I did quite a bit of team sports, like a lot of the kind of the common ones like football, baseball, basketball, soccer, and track and field day and things like that. And it was it was interesting because like for me as a kid, I was thinking like, running is like this thing that you use in other sports, not necessarily a sport itself. I mean, outside of track and field day, it was, running around a soccer field or a football field or basketball court or something like that. And it wasn't until I think my sixth grade year that our PE teacher had us do the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge.
Okay.
And yeah, that kind of highlighted, that's like the first time in my life where I kind of realized like, you're not just either good at sports, average at sports, or bad at sports holistically. There are sports that you're maybe like much better at and ones you're much worse at. And you can be a great athlete in one sport and a terrible athlete in another.
Right.
So like, my mind was kind of blown a little bit when we did the mile run, where I realized like, out of all those different kind of skill tests we did for the presidential physical fitness thing, I felt like I was much better at the mile relative to like the pull-ups, the shuttle runs, and like the V-sit reach and all these like kind of more flexibility / speed and power based things. And one thing that kind of stuck out in my mind with that too was when we finished the mile run as a class, it seemed like all my other classmates just absolutely hated it, never wanted to do it again. And I was like thinking to myself, well, why do I want to do it again? Why am I weird? Is this something going on here? So I think that was maybe the first sign that like endurance sport would maybe be something that I would be wise for me to focus on if I wanted to have like, any semblance of success in it. So, I kind of carried on though. I didn't give it too much thought other than just like, maybe being a little more open-minded about focusing on longer races on track and field day versus like the 100-meter dash or 200-meter dash. And then like when I got into high school, by my sophomore year, I was fairly sold that cross country and track and field are probably the events I should focus on, and the other sports maybe do for fun on the weekends with friends or something like that, but
Right.
not necessarily train for them or really get interested in kind of the methodology behind everything within it. And from there on, it was kind of like just kind of, I would say I slowly learned the process of running in the sense that like, when you look at it from like someone who competed at the collegiate level and eventually the professional level, a lot of those guys and gals will be pretty inclined in terms of doing like, I guess, full year training cycles and things like that fairly early, certainly by high school. Whereas it was probably I think it was the summer before my senior year before I actually started running year round. And then when I got to college, I realized pretty quickly that a lot of the kids on the team had ran a lot more than me just from a volume standpoint. I think I went in
Right.
there thinking a 30-mile week was like this massive training week. And I got buddies that were on the team who were like, oh no, we'd run 50, 60 miles a week in high school all the time. And then as you look in even more, you see even more crazy stories of, high school kids running upwards to 100 miles a week sometimes, which I think is pretty rare, but it's out there. So that kind of opened my mind again to like, just like, well, what is this sport of endurance? Like, what is involved? Why do we do this workout now and that workout then? And why do we train differently for this race versus that race? And that's when I think got interested in like understanding why we do things the way we do them in endurance sport versus just kind of like, oh, the coach said to do this. The coach knows what he's talking about, or she knows what she's talking about. I'll just do it. And that's going to get me my fastest race kind of a mindset. And um, that's kind of what led me into, I think, just endurance sport as a lifestyle more than anything.
So Zach, so actually take me back to high school now. What races were you competing in? Was it, the traditional like 5K or 2 mile run, or what were you competing in? And also what were your fastest times? Cause I'm intrigued to know how are you running back then?
Yeah. In high school, we did, for cross country, we did a 5K, and that was typically on like a golf course or something similar to
Right.
that. And then track and field, I focused mostly on the 1600 and the 3200. So like those were kind of the two events. I would do the 800 once in a while or be part of the 4x800, but I had like very little focus on that. It was more of kind of like an add-on than anything. So I was definitely skewing towards the longer stuff available. From times in high school, my fastest 1600 time, I think was a 4:39, and my fastest 3200, I think was like a 10, what was like a 10:24 or 10:32 or something like that, I think. So like I was good enough. I went to a small high school. We were Division 3 in Wisconsin, and basically for cross country and track and field, there was 3 divisions. So Division 3 is the smallest one. So I
Right.
definitely had a cleaner path, so to speak, to get to like the state meets and things like that. And by my senior year, I was able to qualify for state in the 1600 and in for the state meet in cross country for the 5K. And I think my fastest 5K time in high school was like a 17 flat. Um, so I had a lot to learn, but I was also just good enough, I think, to stay motivated and excited about like where I could possibly get within that sport. And sometimes I look back on it and I was like, man, I'm glad I didn't know how fast some of these other guys are going, or I might have just been like, I might have just given up. Like, who knows? I would have maybe never even went out for cross country and track in college had I known how fast some of these guys and gals are running some of those disciplines that I was, just skimming into the state meet at.
Yeah, I mean, I find that to be interesting because I have a friend who he ran at Princeton. Now he's going to North Carolina to do his get his master's, but he's going to be running there as well. And he's running. I think his PR was 4:09 in high school
Mm-hmm.
for the 1600. So I mean, we're talking fast, man. And I ran my fastest 3200, and I ran in high school as well, but I was mostly like an 800 guy. But my sophomore year, I PR'd at 206, and then after that, I got into bodybuilding and weightlifting, so my gear kind of focused. But
Mm-hmm.
now, as I was just telling you about the military and so forth, we have to do a 2 mile run. So I think I topped out at 11:30, which I was proud of. I was like, wow. In high school, I had done a 3200, and it was like 12:25. But I think what's most interesting is that you are running 6:48 pace for 100 miles now, but it didn't seem like you were necessarily the most naturally gifted runner back when you were in high school, because you said a 4:39. That's a really good time, faster than mine, which was 4:57. But there, as you said, you went to college. There's guys running 4:02,
Mm-hmm.
4:01. So how did you, and I'm talking from a mindset standpoint, so where you came from being definitely above average, but not in the elite, to being somewhere like, where was the moment that you noticed that I can be good at this endurance thing?
Yeah, I think what kind of some things that kept me going along the way was just some relative improvement for myself. So I think that's one thing I've maybe done a good job of is I've stayed away from, for the most part, stayed away from saying like, oh, if so and so's doing this at this capacity, if I
Mm,
can't do that, then what's the point? So I've used kind of my own improvements as like progress gauges, and I think when you can look at like small incremental gains, you can see progress, and then if you just stay patient, eventually you get to where you want to be, or where you're capable of getting. And if you kind of keep a healthy mindset of like, I'm going to discover what my body is physically capable of, or what my mind is physically capable or mentally capable of, then you kind of give yourself a little more motivation to stick it out. And for me, I think a couple things that clicked was just like in college, we would do a 3200, just kind of a fun run at the end of the cross country season. And I think the first time I did that, I ran like a 950 or something like that. So then I
okay.
was like, wow, that was like, you know, 40 seconds faster than my time on a track in high school. So I was
Right.
like, this really does work, actually focusing on building volume and training specifically for events and things like that. So that was exciting for me at the individual level. I'm also just a very curious person. So when I got to college, I think, and I had access to a lot of good resources from my teammates who knew way more about the sport than I did for the most part, and then my coach who clearly knew way more about the sport than I did. It was like, okay, this is great. I have this opportunity to spend a few years kind of learning from these people and kind of seeing where that takes me. And kind of just through that mindset, I guess, I also started kind of just recognizing, well, what types of workouts do I actually like within this sport?
Mm,
And the one that kind of stood out to me was our Sunday morning long runs. We would always, our meets were typically on Saturdays. So the
right.
long distance squat and track and the cross country team would usually wake up at like, I think it was like maybe 7 or 8 in the morning and do our long run for the week on Sunday. And I remember thinking like, this is the one I like to do. This is the workout I look forward to. This is the one that I don't get nervous about. I just want to be out there and doing it. So, when I finished college, I went less from like, okay, I'm going to see how fast I can be at
Yes.
certain distances, and more like, I'm just going to build volume and do the running I enjoy, maybe at the expense of some of the workouts I don't enjoy that would still maybe be good for me, that I do now again, since I've been removed from college and realize I kind of need some of that speed work. But that's kind of what led me into ultramarathon, I think, was just get this appreciation for kind of like the long, slow run, so to speak. And obviously, race day is long, slow run is race pace when you're doing ultramarathons in a lot of cases. So
Right.
I think that maybe in hindsight that made sense from that. But I think like, yeah, general curiosity, knowing that running is a sport that you can do at all levels, and that a lot of times it's a you versus you type of a setup that kept me interested in it, versus like, had I been a relatively decent football player or basketball player, I don't know that I almost certainly wouldn't be doing it now, because I wouldn't have been good enough to go past the high school or collegiate level, even if I had similar capabilities as I did with running. And then like there would have been an end game there. Uh, so I think just like the knowledge of knowing that running is a sport that is like has a low bar to entry made sense, in terms of like, for someone who was relatively health minded by the time I got to college, and liked exercising and wanted to have goals and focuses within that, versus just doing it for the sake of doing it. In most cases, it kind of made sense to me, even if it meant not being the best at any specific thing. And that certainly was what the case was for the majority, and still to the majority of my running is, it's tough to be the best at anything. And yeah, I think if you have like some other motivators in there too, that's probably a healthy way to go about the sport.
So then, Zach, at what point did you actually run your first ultra marathon?
Yeah, it's funny. We were chatting before this, and you were explaining kind of how you picked the first ultra that you did, and it mapped my experience pretty closely. Actually, I didn't even know there were ultra marathons in the state of Wisconsin when I first signed up for one. It was funny. I knew it. I'll rewind a second here, but like, I found out that ultra marathon was a thing my senior year in high school, and I didn't really give it a whole lot of thought, other than that like there was this wild frontier of runners beyond the marathon that, like,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, weren't satiated by the fact that 26.2 miles was the end of their of endurance sport. And I think I really got interested in it though when I read a book, Ultra Marathon Man, it's either my
Right.
junior or senior year of college. And after reading that book, I decided at the time that I remember thinking I would have been like probably 21 or 22 years old. I remember thinking, I'm going to do these ultra marathons someday, but I'll probably wait till I'm about 30 because then I can kind of just, fine tune the 10K, maybe fine tune a marathon, half marathon distance. And then by the time I'm 30, I'll have like exhausted my abilities within those disciplines and I'll do an ultra. But when I was 24, I was just looking on websites to see what races were around to kind of give myself a target. With probably like a marathon in the mindset is like what I would end up actually doing. And while I was scanning that list, there was this race in, they called it Madison, Wisconsin, but it was actually technically more like Milwaukee. It was the North Face 50-mile endurance challenge, the Midwest regional, that was in the Kettle Moraine, which is like the southeast national forest in Wisconsin. And I was like, wow, 50-miler. And I thought, well, maybe I should just do this one and then see, like, just to see if I actually like this. And if I do like it, then I'll know. And if I don't like it, I can always go back and not do it again for a while. And that was the end of 2010. So I did that race. I was fortunate that I had a good enough day to win. And that really got me excited because I had very little knowledge of the sport of ultra marathon. So like, I didn't know if this race was like high caliber, low caliber, or somewhere in between. I just knew I won. And I was also thinking, because I had through college and high school and, the kind of local marathons I jumped into between then and that first ultra marathon, it was like, I knew I could be up there near the front in a lot of cases, but I probably wasn't going to win any race unless it was like a really small local 5K.
So what was your time for that first one?
I think it was like 6 hours and 2 minutes or somewhere around there. And it was just such an eye-opening experience because my longest training run leading in was a 30-miler. I followed a pretty high volume training plan. I think I was hitting 120-mile weeks pretty consistently throughout that training plan. But I remember like mile 35, well, maybe a little after that. It was like between 35 and 40, hitting this spot on the course where there was this, in hindsight, it was a tiny little hill. But I was just completely like floored that the race director would put a hill at that point in the race.
Right. Yeah.
It's funny to think about that now because I mean that's what a lot of courses are built to put you in those positions. And my ill-informed mind at the time had no clue, but it was a great learning experience to know like, okay, I had to like feel good, feel not good, and then kind of feel good again, and that can happen through the course of a single event. And one piece of advice I oftentimes give folks who are getting into ultra marathons is that it's really not a matter of like trying to find a way to feel great all day, because you just won't. There's going to be a time where like you're going to feel worse than you did, or you feel like things are going to be like unsustainable, and those are kind of pivotal points in the race where you have to decide, I guess, kind of how bad you want it, or like why you're out there. And if you can kind of build a list or a bunch of like things that you can kind of use to keep you going in those points, that's what's going to kind of be the difference between a great day and an average day, or even a bad day in some cases, if it eats you up enough to have you drop out or slow down significantly.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like you just hit it on the head. What enabled me to really like push through that one that I did, and I'm not out there setting world records and stuff, but I think that anybody that, and there was I don't know if you've heard of him. I can't get the name off the top of my head, but tried setting the world record for the amount of 100 milers done in a year. And you might have seen on like Runner's World or something, but he was actually at this race and he had done, I think 30 consecutively. I don't know, 30 within the year. But what really intrigued me was that he was carrying the American flag the whole time, and it would take him 28, 29 hours, but he completed it. And then he wound up doing 35, and then his body just couldn't take the rest of them for the year. But it just amazes me how finishing it in its own right is such a huge accomplishment. Like a girl I was running with, she finished in like 28, 29 hours, cutoff was I think 30, but man, I guarantee that she got so much out of it. It didn't matter if she finished first or last. The fact that you traversed 105 miles of land is like seemingly impossible to the ordinary person. But what I think that was most interesting, what you said, is that the purpose is going to show up sometime. Like for me personally, it was two times, and it was probably around 70 or 80, where I just got down on my hands and knees. Like I was explaining to you, I really couldn't lift my feet up more than an inch off the ground. I would sit in a chair. Now, I want to get your take on this a little later, but after every lap, I would sit down in a chair. And do you know how hard it was to get up out of that chair? Not because I was mentally weak, but my hips were killing me so badly. But it got to a point where I just got down on my hands and knees in the middle of the course and was like, why am I out here? And for me personally, goes back to a commitment that I made to my grandmother as she laid there on her deathbed coming off of life support. And it was just, I will always make you proud. And I knew that if I just were to quit, it would have been, well, did I really make her proud? And then from there on, it was like, I don't have an option. I just have to go for these next 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, however long it would take to keep going. And I think that maybe you could speak to it. It just relates to all different aspects of life, not even just running. But I feel like just that one ultra taught me so much about life in general. So I want to hear from you, like an experienced veteran. What are some of the things that you've learned along your journey that has also helped you in your personal life?
Yeah, no, that's a great story. And I think it resonates with a lot of ultra runners. And I think it's what maybe intrigues people to get into the sport too. And, that's one thing I usually share with folks who are doing ultras for the first time, especially 100-milers, is that like, you're going to be like, there's going to be points where you're not wanting to be out there. You're asking yourself why. And, there's different tricks to kind of get yourself going in those scenarios. And they are great life lessons. It's like if you do ultimately break it down into chunks and say, okay, I'm just going to get to that next aid station, or I'm going to get that next lap done, or I'm going to get to this time, rather than thinking of the whole thing, I think that just sets you up to be able to handle life's goals a lot better, because we all have long-term goals. A lot of times they're very long-term goals. And I think where a lot of times people struggle is they go in thinking just about that long-term goal, or they just think about getting to that 100-mile finish line. And that's a tough sell in your mind when you're 60 miles in and your legs are killing you, but you still have 40 miles to go, which is about as long as anyone's going to go for a long run if they do that for a race like that. So like, it gets to be this really weird spot in the race. And I kind of think of that the same thing with life. Like if you have a goal of getting to like, a certain part of your career, or, completing some sort of task and you're 60% of the way, chances are you spent a lot of time getting there, but you still have a long ways to go. So it really does teach you to think like, okay, it's okay to have that long-term goal or that end goal to keep me driven and keep me going and consistent from day to day. But you also want small benchmarks that you can measure your progress along the way, that can be like little built-in rewards for you that keep things kind of running smoothly throughout and keep that motivation high throughout. And when you do have those moments of mental weakness or physical weakness, you can kind of push through them. So the other way I kind of describe it sometimes is like, you can always find an excuse to quit on yourself. But if you have an excuse, or if you have no excuse because you're quitting on someone or something else, then it makes it that much harder to pull the plug or to give up. So like your story about your grandma is perfect, because like, you could have easily justified in your own mind, it's just not my day, I'll come out and do this again. Right. There's hundreds of these races all over the country. There's no shortage of, I'll circle the wagons and live to fight another day. But, you can't tell that to your grandma at that time. Right. So, so for that scenario, I think that's like a perfect example of like what I like to have like some of my coaching clients think about before they go into a race like that, is go in there with a long-term goal or an end goal, but also kind of little small benchmarks along the way. And I think that's just learning that's just taught me a lot in life. And, for a lot of things, like where do I want to be when I'm, the age I am now versus where do I want to be when I'm 50? Where do I want to be when I'm 60, 70? I think about these things now where it's like, those things just don't happen overnight. The big goals that take years and years to accomplish are going to need to have small incremental progress and checkpoints along the way. So the better you kind of outline that, the more organized you get to, in order to analyze that stuff, where you can see like, well, if I want to be here in 10 years, where should I be in 1, and have a tangible result there that you're trying to get to. I think that just makes it that much more sustainable and clear for people to kind of stay focused and stay on path.
Yeah, right. So it's a lot of stuff you're saying really resonates with me. And the one thing that I constantly say, and it was kind of my approach during college, because every student wants to do well academically. There's no hiding that, who wouldn't. But like you're saying, it's a 4-year process. You know, if you get a really good GPA your freshman year, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do it consecutively over and over again. It's kind of like an ultra marathon in a way that it's just so long. And one of the things that I would always tell myself is think macro and act micro. So I would think on, break it down to an ultra, think 100 miles, but then I would act on, you know, these 5 miles to get me to the next aid station, this 5 miles to get me to the next aid station. Like you were saying, it just doesn't overwhelm your mind at that point. It makes it a lot more attainable in your own brain. Like you were saying, I got 50 more miles compared to I just need to go 5 more, and then I need to go 5 more, but only saying that when you get to that next 5. So for me, it really, really broke it down, and it's such an important tool. And I think that, like you finding, so if you, what, in your opinion, I'm really curious as to, was there ever, I'm sure there was, but can you give us an example in which you had to utilize that purpose? If there was like a really tough race where you were mentally fatigued and you really had to go in that bag and pull that thing out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my best example is a relatively recent one. Last August, when I set the 100-mile and 12-hour world records at the Pettit Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You know, that particular race was something that I had experienced before in a lot of cases, where it was, you know, a short loop track. You know, it was a timed event, a lot of controls in an event like that, where like you can see your pace, your splits throughout the course of the day. There's, you know, not a lot of issues with like, well, there's no issues with hurdling over anything, going up or down. It's pancake flat. So like, you know, you have access to your crew like every couple minutes at the longest. And, you know, so I've done events like that consistently through for the last 6 years at this point, and leading into that race, almost 6 years. And I got to a point where, you know, I went there targeting the world record for 100 miles in 12 hours. That was my goal. And I remember when I was at around mile 40, that I had a thought in my mind where I had just run a couple laps that were a little slower than my goal split range. So usually when I go into an event like that, I'll calculate, depending on the length of the track, like a range between like probably 3 to 4 seconds of where I want to be per lap in order to kind of have like my slowest kind of ideal time and my like kind of dream time, so to speak. And I had been kind of hitting in between those all day long, but then started slipping out around mile 40. And I asked myself at one point, I was like, well, maybe I just don't have it today. And I did exactly what I was talking about before. I was like thinking, well, you know, I've got this other race in 5 weeks that I could maybe refocus on. Maybe I should just kind of scale back and lower my ambitions today and just get a good solid long 12-hour run out of this one and kind of parlay that into a future event. And I just got to thinking, I was just like, well, I'm 40 miles into a 100-mile or 12-hour run. And so there is a lot left. But when I think about like the months that I spent preparing for this particular race and thinking about the unique environment I was in the Olympic training facility. So they had like a speed skating rink that they built the track around. So it's like 60 degrees, no sunlight. So you weren't getting hit with sun all day. You weren't getting hit with weather changes. You weren't getting by wind, rain, or anything like that. And I just started thinking, like, this is a pretty unique environment and experience that I have available to me right now. It would be pretty silly to give up when I'm 40 miles into the race itself after a multi-month buildup, where if you look at the amount of hours I spent getting ready for that race, you know, the amount of sacrifices I made just in general life to make sure you get enough sleep and you have the right nutrition and things, the amount of time and energy you spend to get ready for one of these things just dwarfs even the longest race. I guess unless you're maybe running like that race in New York that's like 3,100 miles long, in which case that's kind of
that's only a few minutes away from my house. Ridiculous.
Is it? Yeah. That's a pretty amazing spectacle. But anyway, so I remember I thought about that. Like, well, that'd be silly. Let's just do a couple more laps back in range. Just focus hard, focus on just 2 laps. Let's get it back in range. Just see how I feel. Maybe it won't be any worse. So I did that, and it wasn't. It really didn't feel any more difficult. I didn't feel like running a few seconds per lap faster was any harder. In fact, it felt a little better because I was just starting to spiral my mindset in a positive manner versus a negative manner. And one thing I was really happy I did that day too is when I was at 40 miles, I started to just kind of calculate splits in my mind as a way to kind of pass the time to see like, well, if I keep this pace, I'll be at 50 miles here. I'll be at 100K here. If I continue that, here's my odds of, you know, breaking the world record or finishing at this particular time. And I did that at mile 40. And by the time I got to 50 miles and got to 100 kilometers, I was getting there ahead of where my projections were at 40. So I was just like, I kind of like almost inadvertently set myself up to like spiral things in a positive manner. And I think the point at that race where it really clicked was when I got to about 68 miles. My longest long run going into that race was 32 and a half miles.
Okay.
So when I hit 68, my mindset was like, I've got one more long run. And I'd done enough long runs that were close to that, like between 27 and 32 miles, that I knew, like, I just kind of did a little bit of self-assessment. I was just like thinking to myself, I feel good enough to do one more long run. And then my mind kind of shifted from I'm here to run 100 miles or 12 hours today, which is, you know, a pretty big thing to wrap your mind around, to I just got one more long run to do, which I've done a lot of, and I can do that. So it is really crazy how, like, if you catch these negative mindset spirals before they get too far down and just try to redirect them and get them spinning in the other direction, how big of a difference that can make. So you can go from feeling like physically incapable to like, why wouldn't I be able to do this? And it's just a mindset more than it is anything else.
Right. So you've run Western States, which is another one of the biggest races in the world, and a whole list of big races which includes some of the greatest talents in the sport of endurance sports. So I'm curious, and obviously what you just shared is extremely impactful, but what have you also noticed about some of your competitors that have allowed you guys to really become elite? Is it necessarily that you guys were all naturally gifted to be great runners? That might play a part, of course. But how much of it do you think was developed in a mindset kind of way? Or I think you get what I'm trying to ask here. I'm just curious as to like, what is the mindset of that you see of not only yourself, but your competitors who are at the top of these sports?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a little bit of variance depending on the event. I think once you get up into kind of the 100-mile distance, you don't necessarily have to be like a Division I collegiate athlete talent to be very competitive and even win some of the big races in that world. And I think it's part of it's just relative intensity. Like when you get to a race that is that long, the intensity is low enough that having like this massive engine isn't always going to be as big of an advantage as it would be in a shorter race. So like you get some of these like 50Ks, 80Ks, 100Ks where it's like, if you're going to win world championships, or if you're going to win comrades in South Africa, which are like two very competitive kind of between 80 and 100K type distances, you probably have to be a pretty fast and, have some talent and stuff like that. But, you get some of these really, really long kind of like, especially when you get into the mountain races where now there's also a skill set development that comes with that, with like downhill running technique, just, there's a component of power as well as just raw speed and things like that. So there's all these weird little variables, and they sometimes are weighted differently depending on the event. And I think that impacts things. We are seeing the sport grow quite a bit, especially since I started. It's grown a ton in the last 10 years since I did my first ultra. And I don't necessarily see that slowing down. I think it will become more difficult to just kind of be able to be, I guess, what we would maybe call an average runner and win big races, just because the talent pool up top is going to get deeper and deeper. And then it's like the odds of these guys blowing up and having someone who's like less physically blessed to like, beat them is just going to be a little bit lower because they won't all blow up. But I mean, with that said, I think there's still a lot of room. There's so much we don't know about 100-mile distances and things beyond that from like a physiological standpoint and just like the mental standpoint of that type of race, where, I mean, we'll always have very fast marathoners and, sub ultra marathon distant, super talented people coming in the sport that just don't figure it out or can't figure it out. Just like we'll always probably have folks who are kind of like, solid runners, but maybe never winning, certainly not winning big races in the non-ultra running world for whatever reason, figuring out how to really execute a well-planned 100-miler and doing quite well for that too. So it is interesting to kind of look at the landscape because it is so diverse still at this point where, Western States is a great example because you have the Jim Walmsley winning it. And Jim Walmsley's, in my opinion, in North America anyway, the best ultramarathon runner And he's definitely in the conversation for best in the world, especially when you start looking at just like variety of distances versus one specific discipline. And you know, you have him, and then you also have someone like Jeff Browning, who is
Yep.
almost 50 years old. And
Still
you
killing
know,
it.
yeah. I mean, he was a middle distance runner in high school. I think he played football. You know, this wasn't a guy who was like, you know, winning state in the 2 mile cross country or
Right.
anything like that, or, you know, competing in, you know, like the 10K in college. This is a guy who really enjoys the mountains, really enjoys long trail running and stuff like that. And he just learned how to do it very well. And he's found out how to work with his body to get himself in the best position, and just tactically an amazing racer. So like there's a lot of components, a lot of variables that I think come into a good 100 miler. So ultimately, like the folks that tend to do the best are the ones that they recognize where their strengths and weaknesses are, and they learn how to leverage those things in a way that's going to have them successful on race day and minimize the number of mistakes they make, or minimize how badly a mistake impacts the future part of the race that they haven't gotten to yet.
So then I'm curious as to, and that's critically important. I think it's applicable to all different aspects, like you're saying, you know, the tactical preparation for whatever that you have upcoming. Like you use an ultra marathon, for example. I could use school because I just graduated, obviously. But any military school that I attend in the future, you know, preparing. I just interviewed. I don't know if you're aware of David Petraeus,
Oh yeah.
former CIA director, right? 4-star general, and he said he talked a lot about how when you prepare for something and you meet your opportunity, luck occurs when preparation meets opportunity. So I think that's really what you're alluding to, and I think it's so true that if you don't even prepare for the thing in the first place, you're never going to really you don't know what you possibly could achieve. For me, for example, going into that, I had no idea if I could finish it, if I could do it, but I didn't really prepare for it. I prepared for it as much as I could because of my military training and stuff and so forth. But going forward in the future, now I know my baseline. Okay, I did my 100-miler in 24 hours. Okay, now it's like, what can I do now if I set 6 months out in order to prepare for it? Could I break 22 hours, for instance? So going back to the preparation aspect, what was it like preparing for your world record attempts, not only in the 100-miler, but once you recognize that you had a 100-miler, then the 12-hour. So what was your training regimen like, and also your nutrition regimen? Because I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to especially endurance sports.
Yeah. The training, I always share this piece because, when it comes to like, when you nail a race, when you have a race where you just kind of had everything kind of work out the way you wanted it to, for the most part, it gets pretty easy, I think, to look at like, okay, well, what did that person do in this, like, you know, couple months or a few months build up to that race? Because, you know, people want the magic recipe or
Of course, right.
the perfect approach. And I always share, like, there is a lot of value in looking at that, no doubt about it. I think structured training plan that has you ready for the specifics of your course or your race or your event is valuable knowledge to have. But also understanding that a lot of the result of a really good day comes from just years of consistency, as well as lessons you learned along the way. So like for me specifically, there were parts of that race where I thought of previous races that went horribly for me, or maybe not horribly in all cases, but like where things didn't go exactly the way I wanted. And I used those to leverage that particular opportunity, almost in a way to say, like, it's not happening this time. So like, had I not had those experiences, who knows where. So there's kind of like this mental game and there's this physical game. So like the training though, I think when you're really putting yourself in the best position to meet your full potential on race day, you're going to always be like specializing the last part of your training block to be very specific to the environment that you're going to be racing it and the intensity in which that event's going to take place. So for me, that was a track, and it was 100 miles or 12 hours. So, you know, there's an intensity that I have an idea of what I think I need to be focusing on for the day like that. So I'm always skewing the workouts that are most specific to that intensity in like that last maybe 4 to 6 weeks before I start tapering for it. And since 100 miles is skewed very far to the low intensity side of the spectrum, then it doesn't mean I don't do workouts that are non-specific to race day. It just means I'm going to put them further away from the race itself. So if I look at just kind of like some of the basic systems of training and endurance, you have like kind of your short interval stuff, like VO2 max type targets. You have kind of your long interval, or your like kind of a lot of people have tempo run intensity, or your lactic threshold system of training. And then you kind of like your aerobic threshold, whereas like at the top end of kind of that your aerobic capacity, where you start kind of flipping the switch over to, burning higher amounts of glucose versus, fat and things like that. So there's these different kind of systems that have been identified as like areas to focus on when you're structuring a training plan. And I'm going to still focus on all of those, but it just becomes an order of operations. So some of those short interval sessions that are very non-specific to any intensity I'm going to use on race day, I still find value in them because they build strength. They kind of make you a little more of a well-rounded runner. So it's not quite as one-dimensional, which is going to potentially put you at risk of like overuse injuries and things like that. And it's also going to kind of raise the ceiling on where your aerobic potential can get to by addressing that system. But like I said, since it's not specific to race pace, I'm going to put that earlier on the plan. So I kind of start out there. If I know I'm aerobically foundationally fit enough to start a training program, then I'll start right away with those. And then I'll move into kind of some lactic threshold stuff, which for folks who aren't really aware, that for most people, that's about the intensity you could tolerate for 60 minutes all out if you just did a time trial. So I'll be focusing on that system next, and I'll be kind of building the amount of volume I can do in a week over the course of a few weeks. And then ultimately, I'm going to start focusing on, for me, for 100 miles, aerobic threshold is a pretty good marker for 100-mile intensity on average. So I'll start doing just a ton of volume, as much as I can tolerate, but gradually building up throughout the last few weeks, doing a lot of that in my weekly runs. And then on the weekends, doing long runs in the environment I'm going to race if possible. So for track races, it's nice because basically everyone's got access to a track to some degree. And if they don't, they can kind of like, they can make a pseudo track or simulate that pretty easily. Right. So, I was doing like back-to-back long runs on a little dirt track about 3-4 miles from my house, all kind of at or maybe just a hair below like goal 100-mile intensity or pace, and just kind of like really fine-tuning the specifics I was going to use on race day and addressing that system almost in isolation as I got closer to the race. And the way that kind of looked on paper was the last 4 weeks before the race itself was I had a 130-mile week, 150-mile week. Then I did what I call a deload week, where I just dropped volume and intensity. So I did like maybe 75. And then my final week before taper was another 150-mile week. And I had, I think, 6 long runs in that 4-week time frame, where I was just kind of going out for like between 27 and 32 miles at a pop, and just really kind of dialing in what it was going to be like to hit the intensities I'd be using on race day. And when I do those type of workouts, those are as specific to race day as it gets. So I like to kind of visualize where I'm going to be on that day. And then when I get to the race itself, it feels like I've done a simulation of that part already. So it doesn't feel like I'm as far removed from it. So like kind of what I mentioned before, when I got to mile 68, I just thought about like, well, remember when you did that 32-mile long run? So when I'm doing that 32-mile long run, I'm pretending I'm 68 miles into a 100-miler, and just practicing just kind of like the mental aspect, the fueling aspect, and all these different things. So then on race day, when I hit that point, it's almost like muscle memory versus trying to kind of remember how I do this from 6 months ago when I did my last 100-miler or something like that. Fueling for me is, I think, because that's what you asked about next, right? You wanted,
just dive into a little bit about the fueling aspect, right?
Yeah, so my fueling, I guess, would be considered probably less traditional than what a lot of people do. I think it's maybe a little more, it's a little easier to wrap your head around with ultra marathons, since the intensity of these races are quite a bit lower than, say, your 5K, 10K type events. And so I focus on kind of a high fat, low carb diet, where I'm not following like year round what people would consider like a strict ketogenic diet, where they're focusing on kind of like keeping their carbohydrates below 50 grams per day or something like that. I'm not doing that day in and day out. I am going that low sometimes. It typically is like off season or recovery weeks, or downtime, post-race recovery is when I'll maybe dip that low. But during the like kind of training cycle, I'll be following what would fall within the context of a high fat, low carb, but it's going to change depending on my volume and intensity. So, I might have some days where I'm flexing my carbohydrate intake up to 20, maybe on a few rare occasions up to 30% of my intake. And I'm kind of keeping my fat closer to around 60% and then protein making up the remainder of it. So, for most endurance athletes, they're going to be closer to moderate high carbohydrate. So they'll be targeting maybe 60, 70, in some rare cases, 80+% carbohydrate intake. And I mean, I think it's the science is maybe a little more clear about the performance benefits for top tier athletes with a high or moderate carbohydrate intake at the more traditional distances. But I think once you start getting into these longer events that are getting up into 10 plus hours long, now our intensity is so much lower. There's a lot of other things you want to be able to consider, like how well is your body able to digest taking in food while you're running. Some folks can seemingly just by good genetics, I guess, take in a ton, or train their gut, so to speak, to be able to take in a ton of food during these events. Those folks are probably going to be able to get away with a higher carb or moderate carbohydrate diet and not risk stomach distress as much as, say, someone who has a really hard time getting food in during a race and seems to always find themselves on the side of a trail or in a bathroom, kind of losing their nutrition. So like the way I try to look at it is anyone's goal, whether you're high carb, moderate carb, low carb, in an ultra marathon, is defending muscle glycogen. So what you want in an ideal scenario is to have enough muscle glycogen intact at the end of the race so that you can run strong to the finish. What happens is if your body gets a misconception is that you run out of muscle glycogen. Like nobody ever technically completely runs out of muscle glycogen. What happens is you get so low that your body starts taking steps to kind of preserve what's left. And what it does there is it limits how fast you can go, because it just
Right.
takes
Makes
more.
sense.
Yeah, it's just harder for your body to run certain paces. And this is all relative to like where your fitness is at. But like if you're there's certain paces where your body just is going to require glycogen to run at, regardless of how much carbohydrates you could eat. Zero carbohydrates. If you run fast enough, your body's going to start burning exclusively muscle glycogen. And it just depends on where that point is. So if you find yourself at the end of a race with so low levels of muscle glycogen that your body is like not going to let you run any faster than where your body's burning basically 100% fat, you're just not going to be able to go faster than that. So whether you're following a high fat, high carb, moderate carb, you want to get to that end of the race with intact enough glycogen so that you can still run fast if you need to or want to at the end of the race. And there's just different ways to do that with these longer races. Like you can take an opposite approach of me and train your gut to be able to take in like 300-400 calories an hour, and you'll probably be able to defend glycogen just fine at 100-mile intensity by taking in that amount of fuel. I think the position paper said like 50 to 70 grams is what is typically required for the average intensity of like a single day ultra marathon. Or you can defend muscle glycogen by preserving muscle glycogen at intensities through burning higher levels of fat, which is kind of the route I take. So rather than trying to get myself to be able to take in 300, maybe 400 calories an hour, I get myself fat adapted enough where I know I'm burning high enough fat ratios at 100-mile intensity that by taking in more modest amounts of inter-race fuel, I'll still have preserved muscle glycogen stores at the end. So for me, I might be targeting maybe 40 grams of carbohydrate an hour during a goal race like I did at the Pettit Center. And that's kind of my sweet spot, because it's low enough where it's very rare I'm going to get a stomach issue, if at all, at 40 grams per hour of fueling, especially when temperatures are ideal. And it's also enough for me, given where my peak fat oxidation rates are at, to defend the muscle glycogen to a point where I can speed up at the end of the race if I'm having a good day. So, I mean, that's just kind of like my approach. I mean, it's a bit of a wild, wild west in ultra running, just because like we don't really know exactly what's happening from mile 80 to mile 100 and what is going to be best for any one person. So I really do like this mindset of let's individualize things. So working with a person where they're at versus like when I'm working with someone, they're trying to decide how to structure their nutrition, if they're working with me at all with that, is like, well, what type of an eating pattern is going to be sustainable for you? So if you're the type of person who just like is never going to sustain a diet that restricts carbohydrates to 20% or so on average intake, then, and you can tolerate a lot of intra-race fueling, then, maybe it's not a good strategy for you versus someone who um, generally likes a lower carb nutrition plan and also happens to not be able to tolerate a lot of intra-race fueling. These are kind of two sides of the spectrum. I think there's a lot of individuality, and that's when it gets kind of fun as a coach and as fun as just like a curious person to help people kind of figure out where they're at or where their best path forward is. And I mean, that's kind of just maybe a little bit of the educator in me still that's kind of
Yeah,
trying to
of
come
course.
out.
Right.
But I like looking at that. I have a pretty open mind as to like what people use as an approach, whether it follows my route or goes lower carb than me or higher carb than me. Generally speaking, because I like that kind of individual puzzle solving side of the equation as much as anything.
Right. I don't know if you would approve of my strategy then during the 100 miler, because I was eating a whole lot of pierogies, a whole lot of pizza, and I was doing just okay. And I mean, man, I want to get your take on this because this is something that I did, and I want to know how wrong it actually is. Not the food part, because obviously that's not the most healthy thing to be eating during that time. But after every loop, which was 10.4 miles, I would come back and I would sit down for about 5 to 10 minutes in a chair. Well, this is probably after mile 50. I would do this because the first 40 I was feeling okay, but once it started to get hurt, it hurt a little bit. I would sit down, I would lay down, stretch out a little bit. So is that even a good idea to do that, or do you constantly want to keep your body kind of up and awake? Because I felt myself, it was hard to get out of that chair.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a running, I don't know if I'd say debate as much as kind of like a running joke within the ultra running community of just like the chair and like, like avoid the chair. It's like a death sentence. Um, and I mean, you kind of hit it on the head a bit. Like, if you sit down with something like that and you're just going to tighten up. Like, I mean, you realize it at the end of a race where like you could be feeling really good. Like I was feeling really good, probably as good as I had all day at the end of the race at the Pettit Center when I was coming up on 100 miles and then when I was finishing. But as soon as I stopped and sat down, for like 10 minutes, when I got up, I wasn't running. There was no
Yeah,
way. Like,
right.
so like you do want to be mindful of that. So when it comes to sitting down in an ultra, I think like there are some times when it's a necessity or you're going to have a better scenario because you did it. Some of those might include something like you have a blister on your foot that you need to address or you
Right.
need to like pop and tape up or
Like
something
something
like
that
that.
requires you to actually sit down.
Yeah. So like a shoe change, sock change, these sort of things, like, making sure you're taking care of yourself to the point where you can still be moving effectively at the end versus having something slow you down that you could have controlled by sitting down. So those are kind of good reasons too. Ones that are maybe not so good, just to sit down because you're feeling tired, feeling sore, or you want to eat something. What I tell a lot of my coaching clients is like, when you go into an aid station, you want to kind of go in knowing what you need so you can go grab it and then just walk out with it. Because the way I like to look at it is if you want to take care of yourself, so you don't want to go through so fast that you don't get what you need and end up paying for that later on. But if you can go in and kind of grab your bottle of water, your bottle of sports drink and whatever food you want, and it's not like too much to juggle and you can just start walking out with it, you can start taking care of yourself. You can do a lot of this stuff while walking. So my mode is like, if you can avoid stopping walking as much as possible, that's going to keep your body moving enough where you're just not going to tighten up so much that it's like a pain to run the next full mile because you tightened up too much and you had to kind of like re-loosen up. I kind of compare it to like if you're doing like an interval workout on a track where like you don't see people who are, at least not when they're doing it right, doing like say a 400-meter repeat workout, doing the 400, sitting down for 60 seconds, getting up and doing another 400. They're doing the 400, jogging really slowly, maybe even walking a bit, and then doing the next one because they're trying to keep their body just loose enough, but still giving them the opportunity to recover and do the next one. So if you kind of treat an aid station like the recovery side of like a short interval workout, I think you're kind of in the right ballpark, as long as you're making sure you're getting what you need and taking care of yourself enough that that doesn't come back to bite you. There's some caveats to that. There's races that are literally long enough where people lay down and take a nap.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like that's an example of a race where you maybe would be better off sitting down or laying down for a bit. I haven't done a race like that yet, so all I can say is I can't imagine what it's like waking up after an hour or two and then starting to run again. But
It's interesting you mentioned that, because tomorrow I'm going to have on Mel Urey. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, I'm familiar.
She done the Uberman, and like, that is ridiculous. Like,
Mm-hmm.
she said she would wake up. I was listening to her on Rich Roll's podcast. She would wake up and feel just okay. Like, what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How, after a 21-mile swim, you feel okay? So that's like, it's just incredible how our bodies can adjust and adapt to things as you go. I'll give you a for instance, and you probably heard, I don't know if you might have heard of it, but the Calendar Club Challenge, where you run the amount of days that the amount of miles corresponds to a day. But I actually wound up suffering an Achilles injury from that. But I found out that as the days went on, it actually got easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, do you know the reason behind that, or is it a phenomenon? What would that be attributed to?
Yeah, that's actually something that gets kind of mentioned a bit in some of these like 6-day events too, where people are seeing how far they can get in 6 days. And when you're doing that, you're probably going to sleep, I mean, some of the like absolute freaks will get away with less than 10 hours over that kind of course of time, but that's really rare. So yeah, you're going to have that situation where you're going to bed at night and getting up and running again the next day. And a lot of times they'll say like, it's the first 2 days that are really tough, but once you kind of hit the third day, it's not as bad because you've kind of started to normalize it a bit. So yeah, I don't know if there's really a physiological explanation for that, other than just like, I guess if you do it long enough, like, so not a 6-day, but like maybe something that's like what you mentioned, the calendar run, or if you're doing something like, you hear these adventures like what Dean Karnazes did, where he did 50 marathons, 50 states, 50 days. I think he said like by the time he got kind of like, a good bit into it, it started getting easier versus harder. So it's almost like you progresses, and it peaks, and then it kind of normalizes. And I think when you get to those really long ones, there's probably some adaptation taking place where your body's like kind of figuring out what to do to get you ready. But ultimately, I think what's probably happening if people really want to try to hack that, they're going to be looking less at muscle soreness, and they're going to be looking more at like inflammation and swelling, because like swelling and inflammation is kind of this goofy like word or term that most people look at as like entirely negative. And it's certainly negative if you have to move fast. But,
Right.
When your body swells up and, you see some fluid like in your ankles or your calves or your legs after a big hard effort, that's your body like jump starting the healing process. It's sending resources down to that area to try to like, heal that area, speed up the recovery process. So you don't necessarily want to like push that back from a recovery side of things, unless you have to get out and do another workout. So that's where you get a lot of controversy into like, do I take an ice bath or not? And it's like, yeah, ice baths can be good if you have like block workouts where you have a workout one day and another hard one the next, because you want to be able to do that second workout. Ice baths, maybe not as good of idea if like you just finished a big block workout and the next 2 days you're focusing like almost primarily on recovery. Then you might just want to let that swelling kind of move in. So like, I think that's actually got something to do with some of this, is like, people can figure out like what nutrition and what kind of like tricks and things they can do to kind of keep the inflammation from building up too much by like that third day or fourth day. And they're starting to learn how to manage that in a way that makes it a little more tolerable. But I'm doing a little bit of spitballing here, as I haven't really done
I
a whole lot
think
of multi-day stuff yet. But
no, it's valuable what you're saying, most definitely. But I'm curious, as I was just looking down at what I wrote, and I obviously the 3 world records that I talked about earlier. But if you had to describe for me some of the biggest lessons you've learned from ultra running, what do you think it would be? Because like when I completed that, I felt like I was like limitless. I was like, what can't I do now? So from your perspective, not only completing these ultras, but becoming a world record setter 3 different times, what have you learned? Because from the elite of the elite, I'm curious as to I want to dive a little bit into your mind, into what's going on in there, what's churning in your brain as to like, is there anything I can't do? Or I think that's really valuable, especially for young people, because that can help young people kind of set themselves apart from the rest of society at a young age.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think from kind of, I guess, maybe like a meta way to look at some of this, I think like one thing I like to share with folks is they have like an experience like you did where you're like, wow, what a life defining moment where I just did this thing that you know, years ago, you probably would have laughed at the idea of even trying it. I mean, I was in that boat. I remember thinking doing a 90-mile training week would be something I would never do at one point in my running career. And now here I'm running more than that in a day. So it's like you always kind of redefine your expectations along the way. So kind of having that healthy understanding of maybe I want to plan something that seems unreasonable or impossible right now, but what I just accomplished also felt that way at one point in my life. So I think that puts you in a good headspace. But the other thing I like to share with folks is like you have an event like you did and you're just really excited. And, you know, sometimes this happens from doing something for the first time. Sometimes it happens because you just really nailed a race that you had been trying to nail for a long time. And you're just so excited to get back to do another one that you find yourself signing up for another event before you really know where you're at from a recovery standpoint, from even an interest standpoint. So I like to share with people, like, when you have an event, when you kind of hit that peak of that process, give yourself a couple weeks to just let like your mind and body settle down before you go full sail back into another program. Because I think what I see happen a lot is people will start either a little too soon physically or mentally, and they'll find themselves getting midway through another training program, and they'll be like asking themselves why they're doing it, or they'll be a little
Mm.
burnt out, or they'll decide, why did I try to do this event again? I really want to be doing this type. So like an example of that for me is like I've done a lot of flat, fast ultra marathons. At a certain point in my career, it became kind of stale. It was just like I was kind of just going through the reps again, going through the reps again, going through the reps again. So I started kind of mixing it up where like I would do like if I would do a healthy dose of flat, fast ultras, I would take a step away from that and say, okay, I'm going to train for a trail race. I'm going to train for a more mountainous type race. So like last year, that was the San Diego 100, which is kind of more technical, steep type of mountain course in Southern California. And I mean, just taking a break from doing the flat fast stuff for about 4 to 5 months to get ready for that race and then recovering from it. When I went back into that training block leading into the Pettit Center race in August, I felt so good about kind of re-tapping into that type of training again since I took a break from it.
Yeah, that makes
So,
sense.
so I guess what I'm trying to say in a kind of a long-winded way is like really be honest with yourself about what you want to be doing. So like if you decide I really want to be running on trails, I have those in my backyard, then pick a race that's on an environment like that because you want to enjoy the training because that's the bulk of the time you're spending, you know, doing this. And the way I kind of describe it is like if you're doing this sport for the right reasons, you should be able to have a bad race and still be happy you did it because you enjoyed the entire process leading into it. Obviously some of that's type 2 enjoyment where you're out there struggling through a workout that's maybe not going as well and but you can take satisfaction in the fact that you got it done or that you know you solved or you're figuring things out or you're learning and things like that. So you know make sure you're in it for the right reasons, make sure you're recovering after these big efforts, giving yourself a mental and physical break. um, and I think like what we kind of said in the beginning, having these long-term goals but also giving yourself small benchmarks along the way so you have little success checkpoints to be targeting so that it stays motivating, it stays exciting.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's you hit it spot on. I think that's a big lesson that people could take away from this, those small checkpoints. And then just the second to last thing I wanted to, you could touch on this just quickly. You mentioned doing the 100 miler on the treadmill. I can't remember exactly what you said, but you wanted to do it a part of you because it would make you uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Can you just
Yeah.
talk very briefly about the importance of doing things that are uncomfortable?
Yeah, you know, I just felt like it was something that I mean, obviously I was put in that situation to a degree because of the
Yep.
whole COVID-19 stuff. I hadn't necessarily planned on being on a treadmill for 12 hours, but you know, that was kind of what was available. And one of the things that I was excited about when I decided to do it though was that there was this level of uncertainty with it. Whereas, you know, after doing ultra marathon races for almost 10 years, you kind of figure out what distances you enjoy and what types of races you like. And you start kind of maybe pushing a few more eggs towards that basket. And you're just less likely to run across something where you're like, I'm venturing into the unknown. Like when I get on a track for 100 miles or 12 hours, I might not outperform myself from previous attempts or meet my goal, but I kind of know what it's going to, like, I know like what could potentially happen through the course of that. Whereas with the treadmill, I'd never run more than 30 miles on a treadmill. So there was like this 70-mile unknown where like, I'm not 100% sure how my body is going to respond to this, the mechanics of this particular environment versus the stuff I've done historically. And that kind of retaught me a little bit about kind of one of the reasons I think people, and certainly myself included, got into the sport in the first place is that like kind of like seeking of the unknown, trying something you've never done before, reaching for a goal where there's maybe just as good a chance you fail as that you succeed. And I find that just part of that part of the sport, something that's pretty unique or pretty hard to find in a lot of cases. So, that was kind of one of my motivators, I guess, for the treadmill stuff.
And then last thing I have for you, Zach. So obviously you're a young guy, and we all pray that you have many more years to live. But when you're no longer here, whenever that may be, hopefully not for another 70, 80 years, what is the legacy that you want to leave behind and the impact that you hope that you have on people like myself and people that really look up to you and admire you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this is probably something that's maybe shifted in my mind from when I first got into the sport and first started kind of, especially targeting some of these flatter, faster races, is that like, having a world record is cool. I mean, it's fun to be able to say I have a world record. It was very rewarding to set that goal back in late 2013 and then spend nearly 6 years working towards and eventually getting it. But I mean, the reality is that record will get broken. It's going to get broken. I hope to break it someday again, but someone will come along and break it. So that really can't and shouldn't be kind of my, like, the thing I hang my hat on is that, I've at one point in my life held a world record. What I like to look at is like, what did I do to move the sport forward so that we can ultimately find out like how fast can a human run 100 miles? Because I know I'm not the fastest. I know there's someone who can do it much faster than me. They're out there right now. They've maybe done one before, maybe they haven't. But my hope is that when they get on the line to do that, that they think that I played a role in kind of moving that discipline or that part of the sport forward a bit, that opened the door for someone who maybe would have never otherwise considered doing it to think, oh, this is an option I have. This is an option I have to hop on a fast course and, try to run 100 miles, say, in under 11 hours or something like that. So I think for me, as from a legacy standpoint, I just hope that like, people come into the sport thinking like, if it weren't for Zach, I would have never tried this. If it weren't for like his willingness to share, training tips, all this other stuff, like experiences and things like that. I ultimately want people to kind of be able to enjoy the sport the way I do. So if I can leave the sport and this planet achieving some of that, then I think that would be the most rewarding thing out of anything.
Well, Zach, I really appreciate it. And for me personally, you've definitely had that impact on me. And for like I told you before the show even started, to have you on here is really something that I was so excited about when you agreed to it. So I can't thank you enough for taking an hour plus out of your day to do this. So I just really wanted to say thank you. And it really means a lot to me. And I know the people that are listening as well, because we dove into not only running, but a lot of the mindset behind how you've accomplished what you've accomplished. And I think that that's really the important part.
Yeah, thanks a bunch for having me on, Devin. It was my honor. I like your podcast format, so it was fun to spend over an hour chatting.
Thanks a lot. And for everyone that's listening, I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion with Zach just as much as I did. And we'll see you guys back on the next episode of the One Life Podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening to yet another episode of the One Life Podcast. I hope that you were able to take one or two of these ideas that we discussed today and are able to implement them in your life to make you more successful in whatever it is that you're chasing. Remember, only one life to live, no time to wait. Act now. See you guys on the next episode of the One Life Podcast.